Wow, look at this guy. Corporate Machine says the traits needed to become a successful banker, lawyer, salesman, businessman, criminal, drug dealers are the same. High IQ, high cunning and people skills, high energy and industriousness, high stress, risk tolerance, high testosterone, low agreeableness, high ruthlessness. Now we're going to figure out, is this tweet worth putting the bank saving for later or throwing that shit in the trash and flushing it down the toilet? If you like videos like this where you can get value from these tweets and improve your life and with some comedy here and there, hit the like button and subscribe. It'll help me out a lot. Alright, back to the video. I get why this tweet feels edgy but accurate. It has that sharp, uncomfortable quality that makes people pause instead of scroll. It sounds like one of those truths you're not supposed to say out loud, which automatically gives it more weight. When something feels forbidden and familiar, it hits harder. At a surface level, the comparison makes sense. These roles do attract similar personalities. If you've spent time around high-performing salespeople, aggressive entrepreneurs, corporate lawyers, or people operating on the edge of legality, you start to notice overlapping traits. The way they talk, the way they handle pressure, the way they read people quickly and move fast. It doesn't feel random. High-pressure environments reward certain traits, and they do it consistently. You don't rise to it. You don't rise in those worlds by being fragile, indecisive, and easily overwhelmed. You rise by handling stress, making quick calls, pushing through discomfort, and tolerating risk. That selects for a narrow psychological profile over time. People who don't fit it either adapt or leave. So when someone lines those roles up and says, look, the same traits keep showing up, it doesn't sound crazy. It sounds observant. There's also a reason these comparisons keep popping up online. People are trying to understand power. They're trying to decode why some people seem to win in brutal systems while others burn out or get crushed. Grouping bankers, lawyers, salespeople, businessmen, and criminals together isn't about morality. It's about identifying a personality pattern that thrives under pressure. Let's be honest. Edgy comparisons spread because they feel honest in a way sanitized explanations don't. Saying success requires grit is boring. Saying the same traits that build empires also builds criminal empires force people to confront the darker side of ambition. That tension is what makes the tweet very likable, but it's kind of on that gray area. But lumping all of this together hides some important differences. When you collapse very different paths into one psychological profile, you lose context, you lose incentive, you lose consequences, you lose the systems that shape behavior. Two people can have similar traits and end up in radically different places depending on how those traits are constrained, rewarded, or punished. It's a difference between saying fire exists in both engines and wildfires and pretend they're the same thing. At first glance, the traits line up. Underneath, the structure matters. The tweet feels accurate because it identifies common inputs. What it doesn't show is how outputs diverge over time. High IQ plus high risk tolerance doesn't automatically lead to success. It leads to unpredictability. What stabilizes that unpredictability, rules, ethics, accountability, long-term thinking, determines whether someone builds something sustainable or self-destructs. That nuance gets lost in viral takes. Another reason this resonates is because people like explanations that reduce complexity. The world feels chaotic. Success feels random. A list like this gives order. It suggests there's a formula, even if it's uncomfortable, and formulas feel reassuring, especially to people who feel like they're on the outside looking in. There's also a subtle flattery baked into takes like this. If you see yourself as intense, driven, blunt, high energy, or low agreeability, the tweet reframes those traits as assets instead of liabilities. It tells you, you're not difficult, you're built for high-stake environments. That's a powerful message, especially for people who've been told to soften themselves. So yeah, I understand why people like this tweet. But the danger of this framing isn't that it's wrong, it's that it's incomplete. It points at overlap without explaining divergence. It treats traits as destiny instead of raw material. It ignores how the same qualities can compound differently depending on context, discipline, and restraint. That's why these comparisons feel true and misleading at the same time. They capture a pattern, but not the whole picture. And once you start asking what separates the people who thrive long-term from the people who flame out, even when they share the same traits, the conversation gets a lot more interesting because the traits aren't the outcome, they're just the starting point. Alright, now let's talk about what this tweet gets right. To be fair, this take isn't wrong in the way people usually mean when they say something is wrong. There are real overlaps here, and pretending otherwise would just sound dishonest. The reason the tweet resonates isn't because people are edgy, it's because they recognize something real underneath it. High stress tolerance. High stress tolerance is necessary in all these paths. The part is non-negotiable. Whether you're closing million-dollar deals, defending clients, running a business, or operating outside the law, pressure is consistent. Deadlines, uncertainty, consequences, they don't turn off. People who crumble people under stress don't last long in any high-stake environment. The difference isn't intelligence, it's nervous system regulation. Can you think clearly when everything is loud? Can you act while your body's screaming at you to stop? That filters people faster than talent ever will. Social intelligence also matters more than people admit. Not book smarts, situational awareness, reading tone, understanding incentives, knowing when someone is posturing, bluffing, lying, or genuinely unsure. These worlds reward people who can interpret humans accurately in real time. That's why charisma often beats credentials. It's why deals get done, cases get won, and influence spread. People who think success is mostly technical skill miss how much of it is psychological. Energy and work capacity are another uncomfortable truth. Raw output matters, not motivational quotes, stamina, long hours, repetitions, the ability to show up again after a bad day. In competitive environments, there are always people who are just as smart as you. What separates winners from burnouts is often who can sustain effort without mentally collapsing. High energy isn't just about being loud or aggressive, it's about endurance. Most people underestimate how much success is about staying functional while tired. Risk tolerance absolutely shapes who even enters these worlds. Before skill comes courage. Not heroic courage, practical risk acceptance. The willingness to face uncertain outcomes without freezing. Some people never apply, never pitch, never approach, never start because the downside feels too uncomfortable. That self-selection alone explains a lot of the patterns people observe. You don't see cautious people in high-risk arenas because they filter themselves out long before the game begins. And it's true that not everyone thrives in high-friction environments. Some people are wired for stability, predictability, and harmony, and there's nothing wrong with that. High-friction worlds reward conflict tolerance. You'll be misunderstood, you'll be disliked, you'll be blamed, you'll be pressured. If your nervous system needs pace to function, these environments will slowly erode you. A lot of burnout isn't failure, it's mismatch. So yes, the tweet gets these foundations right. Where people go wrong is assuming that sharing traits means sharing outcomes. Traits are amplifiers, not directions. High stress tolerance can make someone resilient or reckless. Social intelligence can be used to build trust or exploit them. Energy can fuel long-term creation or short-term destruction. Risk tolerance can open doors or shorten timelines. The trait itself doesn't decide the path, the constraints around it do. Another thing this take gets right is that success isn't moral by default. The same internal equipment can be used in very different ways depending on environment and incentive. That's uncomfortable for people who want success to equal virtue. Reality doesn't work that way. Compatibility is neutral. Direction is chosen. What's often misleading for these conversations is development. Traits aren't static. High agreeableness can be trained downwards in competitive contexts. Low agreeableness can be softened strategically without losing edge. Stress tolerance can be built. Social intelligence can be refined. People act like they're either built for it or you're not, when in reality most of these traits sit on a spectrum that responds to pressure and practice. This tweet also indirectly points to something most men don't want to admit. Comfort is the energy of growth in these arenas. High friction environments force adaptation. They sharpen people. That doesn't mean they're healthy, it means they're demanding, and demand creates selection. Acknowledging what this gets right doesn't mean glorifying every path it mentioned. It means being honest about the psychological requirements of high stakes worlds. Denying those overlaps doesn't make you principled, it makes you naive. The real question isn't, are these traits the same? It's, what do you do once you have them? Because traits don't determine character, they reveal it over time. Alright, now let's break what most people are assuming. At first glance, this tweet feels logical. Same traits, different labels, that's why it spreads. But when you slow it down, you start to see the assumptions holding it together. Not malicious ones, just incomplete ones. The biggest assumption is that similar traits lead to similar outcomes. That sounds reasonable unless you look closer. Traits aren't instructions, they're tools. Two people can have the same stress tolerance, social intelligence, and energy and end up in completely different places. One builds something stable over decades, another burns and disappears. The difference isn't the trait, it's how the environment shapes its use and how long-term consequences compound. Outcomes aren't decided by what you have, but what those traits are rewarded for doing over time. Another hidden assumption is that success equals dominance. The framing leans heavily towards winning, overpowering, over-maneuvering, but dominance is a short-term strategy in many legitimate fields. In business, law, and sales, and dominance without trust eventually collapses. Clients leave, reputations spread, systems remember, sustainable success often looks quieter. Repeat businesses, long-term partnerships, credibility that compounds. The tweet treats visible aggression as proof of effectiveness, when in reality, endurance usually beats intensity. It also assumes ruthlessness is required, not optional. That's a seductive idea because it removes moral ambiguity. If you have to be ruthless, then the discomfort that comes with hard decisions feels justified. But most high-performing people aren't ruthless all the time. They're selective. They know when to push and when to preserve relationships. Ruthlessness used consistently becomes predictability, and predictability becomes a weakness. In legitimate systems, people who can't turn ruthlessness off eventually gets boxed out. Another thing the tweet glosses over is systems, incentives, and consequences. A criminal and a banker might both tolerate tolerate risk, but the systems they operate in respond very differently to mistakes. One system has contracts, insurance, and second chances. The other has irreversible consequences. That changes behavior over time. The longer you stay in a system, the more it shapes your decision. Traits don't exist in a vacuum. They're molded by what the system punishes and rewards. This is where a lot of online comparisons break down. They flatten complex environments to personality traits, as if context doesn't matter. But context is everything. The same high energy, low agreeableness person behaves differently when incentives favor cooperation versus fear. Remove that distinction and you miss why outcomes diverge so sharply. The tweet also confuses selection bias with causation. You see similar traits in these rules not because the traits create the outcome, but because they filter who enters and survives early stages. High risk, high pressure environments repel certain personalities immediately. The ones who remain share common features, not because these features guarantee success, but because everything else was filtered out. Observing the survivors and assuming the traits cause the success is backwards. There's also an assumption that testosterone, aggression, and stress tolerance are also assets. Early on, they often are. They help you push, take risks, and assert yourself. But over time, unregulated intensity becomes a liability. Decision-making suffers. Impulsivity increases. Relationships fracture. The people who last learn regulations, not suppression. The tweet doesn't distinguish between raw traits and master traits, and that distinction is where most people fail. Another assumption is that adaptability is secondary to toughness, but adaptability is what actually determines longevity. High performers who last don't just endure pressure, they change how they engage with it. They shift strategies. They soften where needed. They learn restraints. That's not weakness, it's calibration. The tweet frames flexibility as compromise, when it's often the highest form of control. What makes this tweet appealing is its simplicity. It offers a clean explanation for messy outcomes, but real success paths are messy by default. They involve trade-offs, timing, luck, regulation, repair after mistakes. Traits get you into the arena. They don't decide how long you stay, how you exit, or what damage you accumulate along the way. Breaking the assumption doesn't mean rejecting the observation. It means refusing to flatten reality into a single narrative. Similar traits can open doors, but what happens after that depends on systems, incentives, restraints, and the ability to adapt when raw intensity stops working. And that's the part these comparisons usually skip. Okay, let's flip the perspective. At the surface level, the tweet feels sharp because it highlights overlap, and that part isn't wrong. Certain traits do show up across high-pressure worlds, but the moment you zoom out, the more useful questions become how these traits are expressed, because traits are raw material. Expression is the craft. High energy can look like relentless work ethic, or like chaotic overextension. Social intelligence can mean reading a room and build trust, or manipulating people until they catch on. Risk tolerance can mean calculated bets, or rolling the dice until luck runs out. The overlap is real, but the outcome diverges based on regulation. Two people can share the same wiring and still end up on opposite ends of the spectrum. That's where discipline and impulse control quietly decide everything. They're not flashy traits, so they don't get listed, but they're the difference between pressure you use and pressure that uses you. People who lack impulse control often mistake intensity for effectiveness. They move fast, talk big, and take bold risks until the consequences stack up faster than the win. The ones who last learn restraint early, even if they don't talk about it. Long-term success doesn't actually reward raw intensity. It rewards regulated intensity. The ability to turn it on when it matters and shut it off when it doesn't. This is where a lot of hype energy people sabotage themselves. They treat every moment like a battle, every interaction like the test of dominance. That works short-term. Over time, it burns bridges, exhausts aliases, and creates enemies where none were necessary. That's also why ethics matter more than people admit. Not because of morality, not because of morality lectures, but because ethics are strategic. Ethics create predictability. Predictability creates trust. Trust reduces friction. Reduced friction compounds faster than brute force ever will. People who cut corners can win quickly, but they spend the rest of their career managing fallout. People with boundaries spend less energy repairing damage and more energy building leverage. This is where the comparison between legitimate professions and criminal paths break down more clearly. It's not the traits, it's the feedback loop. Systems reward different expressions of the same characteristics. In legal and professional environments, restraint eventually outperforms ruthlessness. In criminal environments, the lack of boundaries accelerates collapse. The same trait expressed without limits produce radically different trajectories. Power without boundaries also collapses fast, sometimes dramatically, sometimes quietly. It might look like a lawsuit, a burnout, a betrayal, or a reputation that can't be repaired. The collapse doesn't come from lacking traits. It comes from never learning how to contain them. People who equate power with dominance often miss that real power is optionality, being able to choose when to push, when to pause, and when to walk away intact. A mature way of looking at it is noticing what isn't being listed. There's no mention of patience, no mention of recovery, no mention of emotional regulation, no mention of long-term thinking. Those don't sound impressive in a tweet, but they're what what separates a sharp rise from a lasting position. Most people don't fail because they lack intensity. They fail because intensity is the only tool they have. This is why you'll see people with killer instincts burn out while quieter, steadier operators pass them years later. Not because they were more aggressive, but because they were more consistent. They understand that pressure is something that goes away eventually, not something you live inside permanently with. Another overlooked piece is adaptability. High performers who last don't just tolerate stress. They redesign their environment to reduce unnecessary stress. They upgrade systems. They delegate. They refine decision rules. They don't romanticize suffering. They treat stress as a signal, not a badge of honor. That mindset alone filters out a lot of self-destruction. So yes, traits overlap. That's not the conversational part. What matters is containment, expression, calibration, the ability to evolve how those traits show up as the stakes change. Raw force might get you noticed. Regulations will keep you relevant. If you do look at it this way, it doesn't deny the edge these tweets can give. It just acknowledges that without discipline, ethics, and boundaries, that edge cuts both ways, and usually it cuts the person holding it first. That's the nuance most viral takes skip, not because it's wrong, but because it doesn't fit clearly into a list. If you're still listening to this, thank you for staying this long, but let's get more in depth. If you zoom out from the tweet for a second, what it really taps into isn't banking or law or crime. It's the way a lot of people watching interpret success, because most people don't actually want those careers. What they want is the feeling they associate with them: power, respect, momentum, control, and intensity feels like the fastest route there. A lot of people end up chasing intensity because it looks like success from the outside. Long hours, high stress, constant pressure, big personalities, fast money, louder confidence. It creates the illusion that if you're always in motion, always pushing, always on edge, you must be doing something. Stillness starts to feel like falling behind. Calm starts to feel like weakness. So people manufacture pressure just to feel alive. The problem is that intensity without direction doesn't compound. It leaks. High testosterone energy, ambition, drive, whatever label you want to put on it, is a raw force. And raw force without a channel doesn't build anything durable. It just burns fuel. You see this all the time in real life. People who are consistently on, consistently hustling, consistently stressed, but 5 years later, they're exhausted, bitter, or stuck in the same place with better stories. Direction is what turns energy into progress. Without it, effort becomes noise. You can be working hard and still drifting. You can be stressed and still stagnant. Intensity doesn't guarantee movement in the right direction. It just guarantees output. And output without alignment eventually turns into resentment. Low agreeableness is another trait people romanticize online. Being blunt, being ruthless, not caring what people think. There's a reason it appeals. It promises protection. If you don't care, you can't be hurt. If you're sharp, no one can take advantage of you. But in real life, unbalanced low agreeableness doesn't just repel bad actors. It repels aliases. And most long-term wins aren't solo achievements. People understand how much progress is social. Opportunities come through relationships. Leverage comes through trust. Growth often comes from collaboration, not domination. When low agreeableness isn't balanced with emotional intelligence, people start mistaking friction for effectiveness. They win arguments but lose access. They feel powerful but incredibly alone. And isolation quietly caps their upside. Stress tolerance is similar. Being able to function under pressure is valuable, no question. But tolerating stress is not the same as recovering from it. A lot of people treat stress like a permanent state instead of a temporary demand. They pride themselves on pushing through without realizing they've drained the system that allows them to push at all. Stress without recovery doesn't make you stronger. It makes you brittle. Sleep suffers, judgment narrows, emotion flattens or spikes. Small problems start feeling overwhelming, and because breakdowns rarely look dramatic at first, people miss the signs. They call it grind or the cost of ambition. Until their body or mind forces a stop they didn't plan. What doesn't get enough attention is how unsexy unsustainability is. No one posts about pacing themselves. No one brags about saying no. No one flexes rest, reflection, or restraint. But longevity, real longevity, is what separates people who flash from people who build. Longevity beats short-term dominance in almost every domain that matters. Career, health, relationships, reputation. You don't need to win every interaction. You need to stay in the game long enough for your effort to stack. And stacking requires stability. It requires knowing when to push and when to pull back. What to be intense and when to be boring on purpose. For people watching, this isn't about choosing between soft or hard. It's about learning to regulate power, to aim intensity instead of drowning in it, to understand that success isn't a personality type, it's a process. One that rewards people who can evolve, adapt, and preserve themselves while moving forward. The real flex isn't how much pressure you can endure. It's how well you design a life that doesn't require consistent survival mode. Because the people who quietly win aren't the ones who burn the hottest. They're the ones who burn the longest without burning out. And once you see that, a lot of viral takes start to feel less like truth and more like snapshots of one phase, frozen in time, mistaken for the whole journey. So should you put this in the bank, save it in your bookmarks, or should you throw it in the trash, flush it down the toilet? I think it depends on where you are in life. If you're just starting out, I think you should save it, bookmark it. But if you've been through it and you understand how this process works, this video makes sense to you, throw it in the trash. It's not needed anymore. It just fuels your ego. And if you need a little bit of help with with self-improvement, or you need help with understanding what type of person you want to be in the future, fill out the Google Docs either below or above